Tonight on Primetime Politics, the passing of a global figure.
Pope Francis was a voice of moral clarity, spiritual courage, and boundless compassion.
Canadian leaders react to the death of Pope Francis, the leader of Catholics around the world. Coming up, we will speak to the former president of the Métis National Council. She met Pope Francis and heard his historic apology to residential school survivors. We'll explore the impact of that apology and look at the future of the Catholic Church without Francis on the throne. Plus, Éric Grenier, with his latest analysis of the polls, will tell you where things stand with just 1 week left in the federal election campaign. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, this last week of the federal election campaign began with the sad and unexpected news of the death of Pope Francis I.
Dear brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father, Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His whole life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and His Church. He taught us to live the values of the Gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite, merciful love of the Triune God.
The first pope to be chosen from the Americas, Pope Francis was the spiritual leader to the world's over 1.4 billion Catholics, earning the love of millions by dedicating his papal reign to serving the poor, speaking for the marginalized, and working to make the Catholic Church a more inclusive institution, a legacy that was remembered today by Canada's political leaders.
Pope Francis was a voice of moral clarity, spiritual courage, and boundless compassion. He was, in many respects, the world's conscience, never hesitating to challenge the powerful on behalf of the vulnerable.
Our prayers are with all Catholics as they lay to rest the head of the Catholic Church, and we are in solidarity in remembering him and honoring his contributions.
I was at the apology that the Pope did in Alberta to the Indigenous communities, just being acknowledged in that way, recognizing that a harm had happened and that harm was being acknowledged really was powerful. And I think only someone like Pope Francis was able and capable of making that commitment and fulfilling that apology. So I want to acknowledge that.
Dire que j'ai une pensée pour les Québécois qui sont de confession chrétienne et catholique et qui sont attachés à l'institution ou à la personne du pape. C'est un moment dont j'espère que tout le monde pourra le traverser avec sérénité. Donc mes condoléances à tous ceux qui sont touchés par ce moment.
Of course, Pope Francis had a special relationship with Canada, highlighted by a visit in the summer of 2022, a journey that Francis described as a penitential pilgrimage, during which he apologized for members of the Catholic Church who cooperated with the residential school system, saying he was ashamed for the abuse perpetrated by some Catholics.
That I am deeply sorry. Sorry for the ways in which, regrettably, many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppressed the Indigenous peoples. I am sorry. I ask forgiveness in particular for the ways in which many members of the Church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference, in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in the system of residential schools.
Well, Cassidy Caron is the past president of the Métis National Council. She met Pope Francis in 2022, both here in Canada and at the Vatican. Cassidy, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Listen, you led the Métis delegation to the Vatican, and that was in March of 2022. You met with Pope Francis along with elders and residential school survivors, and you were calling on him at the time to come to Canada. How open was he to hear your stories and your concerns?
When we met with Pope Francis at the Vatican, we really shared all of that time with our Métis residential school survivors to share their stories with him so that he had an understanding of what they had gone through, what they had endured. And we really hoped that he would listen. And then we called upon him to provide an apology to residential school survivors on behalf of the Catholic Church. Of course, a couple of days later, he did provide that apology at the Vatican itself. But our survivors wanted that apology here on Canadian soil. And so when we were sharing those stories, what really struck me was the humanity of Pope Francis. You could tell he was truly listening and that he was really struck by the stories of our residential school survivors. And when he spoke his apology on April 1st, 2022, he talked about action and that it needed to be followed by action. And at that time, he did make the promise that he would come to Canada to deliver that apology once again on Canadian soil. And of course, a few months later, he did just that. He made his penitential pilgrimage to Canada, making 3 stops along the way and delivering a similar but different apology at each one of those stops. So that was really meaningful, and I do feel as though it was because he heard those survivors and he felt their hurt, their trauma, and I always just take the time to really thank and honor those residential school survivors for their bravery, their courage, for sharing such hurtful stories directly to the Pope.
And you saw the impact that apology had when he was going across the country, the many survivors who were brought to tears with the apology. He would go on to agree that residential schools amounted to cultural genocide. Months later, he would denounce the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine that essentially gave the theological argument for colonization. What did that do for reconciliation in this country, do you think?
It really promoted reconciliation to a great extent. First and foremost, when we were in Rome at the Vatican, for the amount of media attention that drew was massive. To be able to educate the masses on residential schools, on the harms of residential schools and the role of the Catholic Church, that played a significant role in reconciliation. And then to see, the Catholic Church and Canadians, Catholics, continue on that journey throughout the next few months while Pope Francis was planning his penitential pilgrimage, it really kept the ball rolling on reconciliation. Sometimes within Canada, we see issues, get quite large, get a lot of attention, and play a big role in the fabric of our society, but then it just disappears. And so for Pope Francis to continue the conversation throughout those months, and then, like you say, as he was leaving Canada, he made that announcement that residential schools did amount to cultural genocide. He had that conversation then rise to the top of our consciousness. And then a few months later, again, denounce the doctrine of discovery. To continue that conversation throughout many months, throughout over a year, I would say, it helps make sure that the issues don't fall to the wayside and don't get taken over by other issues within Canada, because reconciliation does not start and does not finish with an apology. It really has to be followed by concrete action, and we need to continue to see that action in the coming months, the coming years, and generations.
How would you concretely describe what you'd like to see going forward, though? Because, even when Pope Francis was here in Canada, there was the talk how it was the beginning of the process, not the end of the process. So where else would you like to see the action move, given the history and what Pope Francis did in terms of reconciliation for this country?
So I wrote about some of my reflections in the Toronto Star this morning. Those reflections go back to the apology that Pope Francis delivered on April 1st at the Vatican. He tasked the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, the bishops here in Canada, to really carry forward the action of reconciliation on the ground here in Canada. While I was the president of the Métis National Council for the last 3 years, unfortunately, once Pope Francis went back home after his journey here to Canada, I didn't see that action continue from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's really important that, the call that Pope Francis provided to them continues. And what that action looks like is going to be different all across the country. It's going to be different for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Reconciliation starts with a conversation. It starts with, wondering what is necessary with these communities. For the Métis Nation specifically, we were calling for truth, justice, healing, and reconciliation. And there's actions that have been identified within all 4 of those values. It starts with acknowledging that Métis went to residential schools and that they need to have that recognition and that justice, that compensation, that recognition, and it's different for everyone. So it's all about conversations, and really, Pope Francis tasked the bishops here in Canada with that work, and I really do hope that, with the passing of Pope Francis, that it's a renewed call for action, and that there will be more conversation moving forward.
Cassidy, Caron, I always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's continue the conversation now with His Excellency William McGrattan, Bishop of Calgary, also President of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Excellency, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael, as well.
Now, I will be very honest with you. I did not expect to hear what we just heard from Cassidy Caron, but you heard what she said about where she'd like to see reconciliation move forward. How would you answer what we just heard from the former president of the Métis National Council?
In some ways, I appreciate Cassidy's recollection, and especially her work at the time with her and the other leaders of the Inuit and First Nations. I think that delegation, first going to Rome, and Pope Francis having the opportunity to personally listen to the impact of residential schools, really, I think, was the turning point to see that this was important, and he saw that the bishops who were present as well for those meetings, he tasked us with being committed to that. It is a long process, and I also acknowledge that there is more work to be done, as Cassidy mentioned. As well, I would say that we have, as a conference, been restructuring our Indigenous Council, making sure that those voices are much more present in our deliberations and discussions. Also, I would point to the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund, the collection and the commitment of over 30 million here that continues to sort of be directed towards these projects of healing, of education, of the recovery of culture and spirituality that Pope Francis mentioned, was obviously the travesty of the residential school system. That the cultural language, the cultural heritage of these peoples, the Indigenous, were affected through that form of education and colonization. There is work to be done, but I'm grateful to her understanding of how impactful and historic his visit here to Canada was, and that, yes, he set the direction and the path for us as a church, and I think Canadian society, to continue that penitential pilgrimage with our First Nations, our Inuit and Métis brothers and sisters.
So a direction and a path. Is it fair to say then that you believe that the spirit of reconciliation, its priority for the conference, remains today?
I would say it does. As we say, sometimes we look for immediate results or signs of fruits of that. But as I pointed, I do believe that there was the desire, and the invitation has always been there for the conference to continue this dialogue with the leaders of the Métis, the First Nations. Those continued as we developed letters of apology and commitment to the TRC following the visit of Pope Francis. So there was always been, I think, a spirit of wanting to walk together and a spirit of collaboration that we needed to both commit to this path, but also to educate Canadians together so that it wasn't just simply the voice of the church, but we were first listening to our First Nations, our Indigenous, our Métis brothers and sisters. This was important, and it continues to be important at the local level as well for each bishop.
Now, you did release a statement today on the passing of Pope Francis, and in it, you note the following, that Francis, he advanced, you say, the Church's ongoing commitment to address sexual abuse in meeting with victims around the world in order to promote both justice and healing in their lives. You know, sexual abuse is a reason many Catholics have left the Church. It is also what critics say against the Church. How did Francis change that dialogue, and how is that being addressed right now?
Well, I think we know that Pope Francis' heart was to those who found themselves in situations of injustice, suffering, and of course, at the hands of those individuals within the Church. And so his commitment to offer apologies in many of the visits that he has undertaken in his pontificate, he made a priority of meeting with victims, listening as well to their stories, and offering his personal apology. The protection of minors has become a very important reality, and many of the changes with regard to reporting, ensuring that bishops and the Church are following procedures of justice, making sure that we are sensitive to the voice of victims. This has all been under the leadership of Pope Francis. And also Cardinal O'Malley, who has been instrumental in this whole area, having been asked by Pope Francis to take on this very important area of work, of healing, of making sure that the Church is not necessarily just sensitive and trying to protect, but actually trying to address that past history and pain of those victims of sexual abuse.
Now, Pope Francis also worked for a more inclusive church, the 2S LGBTQ community, divorced people, single unwed mothers. Is there a place in the Church still for those groups without Pope Francis?
I believe that he set the path in the synodal gatherings in the last 2 years, where many of these conversations and these voices, the role of women, those who are marginalized because of their sexual orientation, those who are disadvantaged because of political situations, especially also the young. He was very sensitive to how society and culture was sometimes adversely affecting the young people. So I think the path of synodality is a path and going to be a legacy that Pope Francis says that these voices, those individuals within the Church, should have the opportunity to enter into this dialogue, and for us to have a sense of listening and to understand where and how the Church can continue to walk with them.
So in terms of the inclusiveness, it's still a path that's open without conclusion? Is that what you're saying?
Well, this is, but my experience in this last synod is that those conversations, that dialogue, Pope Francis has recognized, and I think the synod process and the final document also addresses that particular area. The Church needs to be sensitive, needs to be open to listen, and that path forward can only be a path that is one of dialogue.
Now, Bishop, I'm going to ask you a question here. You know, as a Catholic, less a bishop, but as a Catholic, what lessons will you carry from the life of Pope Francis?
I think for me, in my experience, and I guess I would have to take off my mitre and my hat as the bishop, but is his humanity. Often I witnessed that in the delegation where he met with those individuals. I saw someone who was truly concerned, a father figure, and also to us as bishops, even though we did not speak during those meetings, we were silent. He spoke to us at the end, and he was very encouraging to say, I see the spirit of unity. I see the spirit of us wanting to walk as bishops with our Indigenous. And I really saw in him someone who had words of encouragement for those who are facing difficult situations and difficult paths. So, you know, as an individual, as a Catholic, I saw his words of encouragement to give strength and courage for those who are facing paths maybe of great challenge. And so I took that as a lesson of his own humanity and how he interacted just personally with individuals. And his heart was always open to receive anyone. And that was very evident throughout his entire life and his pontificate.
Bishop McGrattan, I appreciate the time this evening. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, let's get to the election campaign now. As I said earlier, this is the last week of campaigning, with Election Day being next Monday. And for a check of where things stand, let's bring in polls analyst Éric Grenier, the founder and the writer of The Writ. Hello, Éric.
Hello.
So let's begin with some of the new data sets which you were working with this morning. Liaison, Main Street, Nanos, just to name a few. And when you crunch the numbers that we're looking at right now on screen, what are you finding with your own top-line results?
Yeah, I find that we're not seeing as much movement as maybe there might have seemed to have been just a few days ago. We saw the polls that come from Nanos, Liaison, Main Street, as you mentioned. Those are the polls we see every single day. So they're 3-day rolling polls. They are the most up-to-date numbers that we've seen. And while the gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives varies across those 3 polls, we have seen that since the debate, both the Liberals and the Conservatives have both actually come down, and so the net margin between the two, if we're looking at the trend lines, haven't shifted all that much. And we also saw a number of polls that were also published later in the day, not in the exact same time period as those 3 rolling polls, but leaning much more closer to that bigger lead than that close race that we saw from the Main Street survey.
Okay, leaning into the bigger lead, and when you talk about that, it's Main Street that has the Liberal-Conservative tie. It's Nanos that has, what, an 8-point spread between Liberals and Conservatives? What's happening here? Even if you say it's leaning more towards that spread, what's exactly happening that we're having this kind of discrepancy?
Well, I think one of the things we're seeing is, first of all, a lot of this is long weekend polling, which, you know, there might be a little bit more divergences between them. We've also seen from Main Street that they've been one of the polling firms that has had the closest race throughout this campaign. So the fact that they are still showing that closer race while the other polls aren't is not too much of a surprise. There's also a little bit of a link between the polls that have stronger numbers for the NDP and weaker numbers for the NDP, that is also influencing some of the overall results. But I think that when we're looking at the bulk of the surveys, the consensus view of where things are right now, it is looking much more like that 5-point lead, 6-point lead for the Liberals than that tie. We are seeing more often that the Liberals and the Conservatives have that kind of gap between them than these one-off polls. We haven't seen a lot of them that are showing this close race.
Okay, so not as close as some might suggest. When you look at the regions, though, do they back up that type of analysis?
Well, if the regions say one thing, it is that the national polling levels might be masking just how much of an advantage the Liberals have, because even in some of those polls where we're seeing that the gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives is maybe 5-6 points nationwide, we're seeing some big numbers in Ontario. We saw from the Nanos poll, from a Liaison, from a couple other surveys that were out today, that the Liberals had a double-digit lead in Ontario. If that kind of margin is what is actually happening, then that is for sure a Liberal majority government, just to see that kind of gap in Ontario. So while in the regional numbers, you know, we see that the Liberal advantage is very much holding. They still lead in Quebec. They still lead in Atlantic Canada. Most of the polls have them leading, even if by a small margin, BC, that they are still in that majority position. So even in the poll, Main Street puts out seat projections themselves. Even in the poll that had a tie between the Liberals and the Conservatives, it was still more or less a toss-up whether the Liberals could get that majority government or not.
Okay, and so you take the numbers and put them into your poll tracker that you're doing for the CBC. If you know, translate today's numbers into the Éric Grenier machine, what does that look like in terms of seat projection?
It is an advantage for the Liberals. As I mentioned, because of how they have that regional breakdown, we project they win about 194 seats right now, so that is clearly above the majority threshold. The Conservatives would win 122 seats, and the Bloc Québécois would take 21, 5 for the NDP, 1 for the Greens. There is a range of various outcomes for these because they aren't precise projections, but they all really point towards the Liberals being in majority territory. There's very few scenarios where the Conservatives would end up limiting the Liberals to a minority and certainly limiting the Liberals to second place. There's not really much indication in the polls that the Conservatives would be even close to winning the most seats if the election were held today. We still see where things will shift over the next few days, but right now the Liberals really have all the cards.
Okay, as you said, if the election were today, but it's not. It's 7 days down the road. What's the likelihood that things could change with a week left in this campaign and really millions of Canadians already casting a ballot?
Yeah, a lot of that vote is already locked in. A lot of that vote's probably on the decided side of things, so maybe they weren't going to shift anyway. But we're really not seeing a lot of signs of a building momentum. Often when you do see that the results on election day are different from where things were a week before, you usually see it coming. It's usually a building, a trend line that is pushing one party up and one party down. We're really not seeing much of that. A lot of the shifts we've seen from polls to polls are a point here, there, a point here, a point there, not really showing a lot of momentum for anybody, really. So that tells me that I would not expect a lot of movement over the next few days. And if we do see that kind of movement, it might be because of something that happens in the next few days. So right now, from my vantage point, it looks like the Liberals have the ability to continue holding this lead through to Election Day. But we'll always see what kind of events can pop up and shake things loose.
Yeah, and you and I will be speaking again in a few days' time. But for this conversation, Eric, thank you for that. Appreciate the time.
All right, thank you.
Well, before we go tonight, we want to note the committee that oversees election threats is raising another concern about foreign interference. The site task force saying Conservative candidate Joe Tay is being targeted by foreign actors who are spreading disinformation about him on social media. Tay was born in Hong Kong. He has been critical of the People's Republic of China, for which Beijing, through the Hong Kong police, are offering a bounty for his arrest. Here is what we heard from the site task force.
One of the 6 individuals targeted by Hong Kong is Joe Tay, Conservative Party candidate for Don Valley North and a known advocate for democracy and civil liberties in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Since the bounty and arrest warrant were placed on Mr. Tay, members of the site task force have noticed a persistent information campaign on social media platforms where Chinese-speaking users in Canada are very active. This content includes a mock wanted poster featuring Mr. Tay, as well as disparaging headlines and comments.
Now, despite the alleged interference, the site task force says it is not affecting a free and fair election in the Toronto riding of Don Valley North. We are following the story for you. Well, that is our program for this Monday evening. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.